folks will call for immediate action, jumping into stuff that does not turn out well, gets us mired in very difficult situations. We have to think through strategically what's going to be in our long-term national interest, even as we work cooperatively internationally to do everything we can to put pressure on those who would kill innocent civilians.
Big decisions coming up for the president on Syria. Let's get into it with our roundtable. We have George Will, Democratic strategist Donna, Brazile, Washington Post chief correspondent Dan Balz, author of the excellent new book, Collision 2012, and our own Cokie Roberts. So, George, this morning the White House is saying there is very little doubt that the Syrian government was behind this chemical weapons attack. Does the president really have any choice but to intervene militarily?
Well, he does, because we have to read what he has said about this as carefully as he stitched a loophole into what he said. A year ago, he said, a red line for us is when we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons being moved around or being utilized. I don't know what the metric a whole bunch of is, but he can always say this is not a whole bunch of.
But this is the second time the Syrians would have used chemical weapons, and this is on a wider scale. And after the president said that, he said the use of chemical weapons would be a game changer. Donna, what will his red lines, what will his statements to the world mean if he allows this to go unanswered?
Well, I think this is a complex issue, and if we had an easy answer, as Bill Clinton would often say, if there was an easy answer, somebody would have found it already. The president has to still use back channels, not just to make sure this is factually correct, but to get our allies in the regions on board, on board with us. Secretary Kerry is meeting with his counterpart in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, to ensure that they're on board. Of course, there will be attempts to go to the UN, where the Russians may once again defeat our efforts. But the bottom line is, President Obama needs to spell out an Obama doctrine for the Middle East. We cannot simply go in and police that region, because they don't really want us to play in their backyard.
Well, except to the degree that they do. And there is a sense that we've abandoned them. And that is a terrible problem for the United States. We can't be in that position. And look, is it complicated and horrible? Yes. I mean, we just heard the former Egyptian foreign minister say, it always starts off small, right, and then it gets to be big. And he says at some point the whole region would be involved. Now, that's exactly what everybody is terrified of. But the fact is, we also can't be uninvolved, because if you just leave it to fester, and you have people both in Egypt and in Syria feeling like we have abandoned them, that the United States of America is not on their side, that becomes a breeding ground for terrorists, and then that becomes dangerous for us in the long run.
And Dan, with these weekend meetings of the National Security Team at the White House, with the warships in the region, you can sure hear those war drums beating. Just today, the Syrians denied the UN access to this site, although now we are hearing, just in the last few minutes, the Syrian government saying that they will allow the UN inspectors in. They clearly anticipate that this time it's for real.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what they're looking at inside the White House, and we can all see it, is weighing the sort of the price of inaction versus the cost of action. And the question is, has this come to a moment in which the price of inaction is so high that something has to be done? And you can see the machinery moving in that direction. And as we heard from Martha earlier, the question is, how much can they stitch together in terms of international support? What do they do about the United Nations? And the other question is, the options that they're looking at would be, in essence, symbolic. It would be some kind of a limited strike. It wouldn't change fundamentally the situation that is there. So that's the equation that they're debating in the White House, and they've been going round and round for days, looking at these options with people taking different sides at different times.
But doing something symbolic matters. And it is sending a signal. And the fact that the president did make this very firm statement, even with his loopholes about a whole bunch of, people are still expecting him to do something.
The president knows that if Assad reestablishes control over a unified Syria, or if his enemies establish control over a unified Syria, Syria will be governed by people hostile to the United States. That's a given. So there are things worse than a stalemate.
And it's billions of dollars we're talking about once the United States. Look, we're already on the hook for humanitarian aid in Jordan and Turkey and other places, but we're in Afghanistan. The American people are war weary. So I think the president will have to explain it to the American people, explain it to Congress before the United States steps into this region once again.
I mean, given that, Donna, this is a president who ran against the idea of unilateral U.S. military action around the world. I mean, that was one of the central planks of his rise to power. Could you really see him going in another military campaign in the Middle East without UN authorization?
I don't see it.
It doesn't have to be. It would have to be international authorization. It doesn't necessarily have to be the UN. In the way it was in Kosovo, they used the NATO authorization. And to put together an international group, I don't think the United States could or should or in any way go in by itself. But to have some sort of international sanction, I think, is doable without the UN.
Although, Dan, what I'm hearing this morning from the White House is they believe there is a sliver of hope that Russia could actually go along with something out of the UN now, that this crossed a red line even for Russia, if in fact this is definitively proven, as it appears, that the Syrian government did.
You know, John, I think part of the question is how definitively proven and how long that might take to definitively prove versus the question of the preponderance of evidence looking pretty clear at this point, and does he feel that something has to be done, or do others feel something has to be done before then? That's part of the equation, and the issue of should he wait for the UN, or can he in some other way put together international consensus to do it?
But what's interesting, George, talking to U.S. officials on this, is you get the sense that the belief is not that military action can be decisive here.
Right.
That it's really military action because you need to do something because of what the president said.
And our military is rightly leery of making a gesture. They're not in the gesture business. And they have a feeling that's what they would be doing, lobbing cruise missiles, these standoff weapons, into a country to make what, us feel good or look good? The president on CNN this week said, the use of gas is going to require America's attention and hopefully the entire international community's attention. Now, some people believe in the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, the Loch Ness Monster. Others believe in the international community. It's a fiction.
But isn't there a credibility question, though?
Yes.
I mean, if the president draws a red line and says, this cannot happen.
It's almost
doesn't
as
it
if
have to do?
It's almost as if Assad is taunting
because
the United States.
Iran is watching this. That's the big thing.
Yeah.
Iran is watching this little dance of dead lines and red lines, and they're deciding it doesn't mean a thing.
Absolutely.
So I want to move to the other big national security story this week. Yet again, the NSA and these surveillance programs. And there were yet more revelations just this past week. The Wall Street Journal reporting that the program covers 75% of all internet traffic in the United States. So, Cokie, my question to you, the public has largely been supportive of these programs, but all this drip, drip, drip revelations, are we going to reach a tipping point where...
Doesn't look like it at the moment. I think, we're going to have... Senator Feinstein has said she's going to hold hearings when Congress comes back into session. And there will be a sort of libertarian, liberal coalition of people saying, we've got to stop this. But I would be very, very surprised if Congress actually does anything about this.
Well, the first thing they should do is have a little bit more oversight. I mean, when you see the FISA court and others talking about violations, there's a problem. And the president and I think the administration needs to get ahead of some of this dripping and this leaking, because more and more is being revealed each and every day.
And when the president came out and he announced he was going to do some reforms and review all of this, he didn't sound like he was really necessarily seeing this as, this was more of like one of those phony scandals.
Oh, no.
Because remember how he described it, and I've got the sound right here, he compared it to being able to prove to Michelle that he did the dishes.
If I tell Michelle that I did the dishes, now, granted, in the White House I don't do the dishes that much, and she's a little skeptical. Well, I'd like her to trust me, but maybe I need to bring her back and Show her the dishes.
I mean, he was talking about his reforms. So, I mean, these are not, putting a privacy officer at the NSA, George, is not exactly fundamentally changing any of this.
The FISA court to which Donna referred is not a court in the normal sense, in that there's not an adversarial process, because only the executive branch is represented in this court. And what happened this week, two things. The FISA court said that 3 times in less than 3 years, it has been misled by the NSA. On the other hand, Bob Mueller, leaving after 12 years as director of the FBI, the longest serving director since J. Edgar Hoover, said, if we had had the NSA system we now have, then when Khalid al-Midhar made a phone call, one of the 9/11 hijackers made a phone call from San Diego to a safe house in Yemen, we might have found it and we might have unraveled the conspiracy.
And that, there you are.
And that's why you have the support.
That's right, because you know, all the complaints after 9/11 was nobody had done this, and they didn't connect the dots and all of that. And so there is support for it, but there is a problem here. You know, the president says Michelle would have to trust me, right? And and he had said earlier, if you don't trust me and the Congress and the courts. Well, you know what? People don't. Right. And that's the bottom line problem. And that becomes a problem for the president in everything that he's doing, because he believes in government and he believes in big government. And to have people not trusting the government on any level becomes a big problem for him.
I mean, one of the things that's happened, I mean, and there's clear frustration inside the White House, I think, of these revelations that keep coming up about things they didn't know and mistakes that had been made. But, I mean, there is a shift in public opinion. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the public is not tipped in the side of civil liberties versus security, but there is an erosion, and I think that what this has done, when people thought about this in the past, they thought, well, yeah, that we should do everything we possibly can because they're going after the bad guys. They're not looking at me or you or anybody else around this table or, you know, the average person. Now people are beginning to say, well, what are they getting from me? And I think that changes it slightly.
So I want to turn, we had another big development this week, more Nixon tapes. 340 more hours from the most transparent administration in the history of mankind. George, I want to play one particular call that was released for the first time. This is the last tranche of Nixon tapes that'll come out. Ronald Reagan calling Richard Nixon right after he gave a big speech on Watergate.
You can count on us. We're still behind you out here, and I wanted you to know that you're in our prayers.
How nice of you to say that.
This too shall pass.
Everything passes. Thank you.
And Richard Nixon in April of 1973 saying everything passes.
Well, true, everything does pass.
So,
George, might not be so nicely for him.
As I went back, there was a young rising star conservative columnist for the National Review at the time who was writing some columns about this. At almost exactly the same time of that phone call, George Will, you wrote in National Review that the unfolding Watergate scandal, the unraveling Watergate cover-up, indicates the moral turpitude of certain staff members has exceeded even their delusions. George!
I see why you're not on Twitter.
You were a lot harsher than Ronald Reagan on Richard Nixon.
I became a columnist in January 1973, just as the Watergate dam was about to break.
Well, that was
it was awkward, but, you know, the phrase, this too shall pass, if Nixon had burned the tapes, he'd have finished as president. There's no question in my mind about that. That's what cost him this. The interesting thing in the tapes this week, because it dovetails with the NSA story, is Nixon saying about Chuck Colson, one of his aides, go out and say this is a national security matter, butt out.
Yeah.
And people are therefore, even 40 years on, reluctant to butt out.
Yeah. Well, the tapes always kind of break your heart, because at the same time that you have these, you know, scurrilous things about trying to cover up and all of that, you have him talking about China on these tapes in a way that is so smart and so interesting, and you just, you know, it's the tragic flaw.
But the notion that we had, you know, virtually everything said in the Oval Office on tape.
I mean, in the Oval Office.
It's quite remarkable.
What president could survive that scrutiny?
Well, we have Lyndon Johnson tapes that are quite remarkable.
But not as extensive. I mean, this was just about everything.